years. I've been helping them build modern business functions, legal functions that are not only bespoke to risk management, but also value creation. And what is a modern law function? A modern law function operates on the principles of talent, processes, technologies, service providers, and data. And that is the topic of today, and we're going to shortly get to it. I've got a great set of panelists today whom I've met over the years and have had the opportunity to observe their quest for conquering data and decision-making through analytics. They represent a wide variety of sizes of organization, experiences. They've come from organizations that are organizations and one-person organizations. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is for our topic, let's get through introductions, and then we're going to set up our conversation on how do we seize the data, how do we use analytics behind decision making. So I will hand over the mic in the order I can see people on the screen to Greg. Greg, if you want to introduce yourself and a little bit about your experience and how do you relate to this topic?
Sure. Thanks, Danish. It's good to be here. I want to be an OG cowboy legal ops professional since I started in the 90s with PricewaterhouseCoopers and their financial advisory group that's gone on to become FTI. Began a consulting company that started doing technology for law firms and eventually began coaching corporate legal on how to do fixed pricing, process improvement, and purchasing from law firms. And then in 2014, I joined Kaiser Permanente as their head of legal operations. And for the last 9 years, have been helping to lead a transformational journey where data is the heart of it. I like to say our general counsel was kind of like the old Princess Bride story of the Dread Pirate Roberts. And he would come in and say, well, Wesley, tomorrow when you drop that RFP and solve everything, we won't need you anymore. And I would say, I do not think you know what you're talking about. It is not going to be a simple RFP drop, but it's going to be really getting the kind of information that can help lawyers to make decisions about how to manage the work more efficiently. And as we'll talk about today, that can be a multi-generational journey. So glad to be here with you all.
Thanks, Greg. I'll go next to Heidi.
All right. Thanks, Danish. And hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon or wherever you are in your time zones. I am Senior Managing Director at Morae Global, and I lead our strategic advisory or consulting practice, working with in-house legal departments as well as compliance departments. My background, in addition to consulting, includes 10 years of in-house working at the Sears and Sara Lee legal departments. I am someone who I love process and financial improvement. Love to roll up my sleeves and dig into that and help others. And I've also I think my whole career, I've really had the mantra of letting lawyers be lawyers. So stripping away some of the difficult system or process work, having them involved, but letting them be lawyers. And with that, I will pass it back to Danish.
Oh, thanks, Heidi. And I've known Heidi for a long time, learned a lot from her. And live from Paris, France, Alex Gallardo.
Hey, hi, I'm Alex Gallardo. I am the Global Director of Commercial Strategy at Bryan Cave. Just recently joined within the last 6 weeks from Shell, and actually where I was there for almost 6 years. And before that, I started my career in legal at a few small known law firms, Fulbright and Jaworski, that is now Norton Rose, was my first one. But like Heidi and Greg, I think a lot of the passion came from trying to make improvements on things that were happening. So process improvements and focusing in on that, and also capturing value. So being on the firm side and being on the client side, and then now going back to the firm side, looking at what value means, because value means something different to the audience or to the people you're working for, and how do you get the best use of not only the resources that are available to you, but also working with the people that are on your teams or available to your team. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I know you've been traveling and you've been kind enough to still make it to the panel. Before we jump into our topic of today, I'd like to kind of know the attendees as well. So while we kind of switch slides, it'd be great if all the attendees, you could drop in your name and maybe your company, or at least a location from where you're coming in into the chat. It will be great to kind of get introduced. And I'm able to change slides and nothing blew up. So kind of going back to our topic where we talk about seize the data, putting analytics behind your decision making. Legal departments have gone through a very transformative change in the last couple of decades. I mean, as we've all talked about, there's a fundamental acknowledgement that legal departments are business functions and they need to operate and elevate their operations similar to any other organization within the company. And 2023, post-COVID, I mean, we're still seeing a lot of economic and regulatory challenges that are coming out. And the topic we chose around data, and especially around spend, was it's a tangible item. Everybody has spend. It is also helpful for people to understand in a common language. But I mean, our hope is at the end of this session, you're going to be able to take the learnings and apply it to any area where you have data. But as we see, I mean, a big percentage of our surveys in the market, a big percentage of our respondents are saying they're facing legal department budget cuts. Either they've happened already or they're coming. Similarly, as we talk about not only the spend, external spend, but when we look at the headcount and internal spend, a good chunk of 80% of the respondents to this Axiom survey that was done earlier in the year responded that there's some effect to the headcount that is happening. Now, the question is, what does that mean? And what can we do to address it? And our goal today would be to take a proactive approach to try to build it instead of it happening to us or legal, where everybody says, hey, we got to do X or Y or Z. We're able to make a proactive determination of which path or which types of actions we can take. Now, before we jump into our discussion, I mean, this is a very interesting survey statistic that I've seen over in different formations in different places, that as legal operations experts, as business managers in legal, as managing counsel, as general counsel, our desire is to really do more when we are doing decision making, to take the data, to take all the data points and make an informed decision. But this statistic also shows that we're very aware of how much we are able to do that. So you can look at different aspects of matter outcomes, discovery costs, selection of counsel, selection of venue. And I tend to focus on the right side, which is sort of the dark blue, that approximately 40 to 50% in each category, organizations are not able to leverage data as they would like to. So that is a very staggering statistic that there's still a long way to go. So I'm just kind of looking at, thank you very much, folks, for entering where you're from. We have, it's good. We've got some folks from Jersey City. We've got folks from Broadridge, Dallas, Texas, Southern California. We've got a good cross-section of folks attending. So with that, what I'd like to do is we're going to go on to a little bit of a journey with each of our panelists and share their experience and what, over the years of experience that they've amassed, what is some advice that they can give us for somebody who is starting to think about data or who's starting to think about systems and processes, and what can they do to get going? And then we're also wanting to make sure that we are going to address folks who are already in the middle of their journey. What are the things they can expect as they reach their goals, and so on. So with that, I'm going to pass that on to Greg. We're going to have an opportunity to ask questions. Please drop your questions in the chat as kind of Greg takes us through his journey in 3 acts of his data quest.
Cool. Thank you, Danish. And you mentioned, somewhere around an average of 50% of those stats are never even getting looked at. So we're going to talk a little bit about the journey to Neverland, because sometimes when you get involved with data analytics, it can feel like you're doing a whole lot of work and you're never really getting to the land you want to get to. And I'm going to give you the hint, spoiler, you never actually do get to the finish. It's really, at least at this point in our maturity as an industry, and an ongoing journey. And the thing to kind of ease your mind with is, playing with data analytics is like playing a game. And the good news is it's not a Game of Thrones, so you're not playing to die. Sometimes it might feel like a game of chaos where you're just trying not to drown. But the fact is, it really is a game of cooperation and planning. It requires a lot of different stakeholders. It's not just we've got a system and we can pull out the data from a magic report and do it all. It's really a lot more like putting together a winning team, where you don't just need any one all-star, but you need a group who really can change the game by using data analytics to figure out that the 3-point shot is 50% more valuable than the regular shot, and hence the Warriors. So, what is important about good data analytics? Well, it can be a whole host of things, but in the center of it, it's about outcomes. And whatever you're going to do with data, if it's not leading you to something that you can take action on and then make an outcome happen, then it's really kind of all for naught. But the kinds of data that we're looking at Kaiser Permanente, controlling costs, looking out for the client's interests, being able to scale services. And one that I think many of you are becoming more and more familiar with is diversity. And how do we actually use diversity to move the needle and not just have kind of the feel-good sessions? And so what we discovered at Kaiser is it's a multi-generational kind of approach. So we started out 9 years ago when I first joined, and it was generation number 1. And my general counsel wanted to know how much were we spending. And I remember at the time, the finance manager would require 30 days in order to give him the spend report. So what we did was we dumped the data into a pivot table. For those of you who are familiar with spreadsheets and pivot tables, we went from 30 days to 3 hours. Now, mind you, when we gave him the result and I said, well, it looks like you've paid $5 million in March, that didn't mean that's what he actually did in March, because the invoices were coming in so late that 3 million of that 5 million in March was from work done in December. So early data is really about making the best use of just what you got and being able to use tools that can quickly do it. And so the next step in our generation 1 was actually engaging a consultant, somebody that could come in and full time start to do spreadsheet jockeying so that we could do more than just a pivot table. We could start to put some bar charts together. We could start to tell a story that the attorneys could make sense of. And kind of, believe it or not, you'll see on this game board, we made it quite a ways on generation 1 because we actually started working with an outsourced dashboard provider. And so we really would make our data dance, even with the bad structure and the bad quality of it. We were using outside resources that could really help massage it and very quickly make it look like we had very mature data. So the good news is we could do all kinds of basic spend tracking. We could do it quickly and in multiple dimensions that had never been done before. The bad news is we were having to make do with whatever the structure of the data was in the system at that time. And we were having to make do with very dirty data. And so, at best, we kind of were able to start to uncover who are we spending money with and how much are we spending. And believe it or not, we end up spending that kind of Pareto proportion of too much time with the people we spend too little money with and not enough of the time with people we spend a lot of money with. So that began to prompt us into the second generation of, well, how do we actually manage our work, not just track our spend? And the thing that's interesting there is it didn't matter how much we had made progress in generation number 1. When we started generation number 2, we had to take a huge step back. The first thing we were trying to do was put a new system in place that actually gave us the data elements that we wanted instead of just the data elements we had. And we thought, we're going to win now. We're going to make it the way we want it to be. Well, installing new systems, implementing change, understanding how those systems work actually require us to take some steps back. So while we were so mature in these dashboards, when we put this new system in with all this data structure we wanted, it was like a couple steps back just to even do the basic spend reports, right? But over time, we began to insource the ability to work with the data. So no longer a consultant or an outsourced dashboard, but one of our members of the team began to get trained in business objects and began to groom this SAP business objects universe to actually say the labels that you want and work the way you wanted. And one of the tricks to the trade was not only bringing it in-house, but then really hiring outside expertise, in this case from Mitra Tech, to be able to train our in-house data expert on how the system worked and what we were going to do with it. But we still would actually use some outsourced capabilities or external consultants to do kind of the one-off acrobatics when we needed to do really something more than our basic spend tracking in our new environment, but we wanted to look at how to manage a matter. We would still use outside resources to be able to help do that in a one-off and quick kind of state. And so really what it did was we at least started getting closer to how to manage the work. So we weren't tracking the spend, but we were starting to be able to see who's doing what and how they're doing it. And this is just a scatter plot of all the timekeepers. It's amazing when you look at your outside counsel, how many timekeepers you have and how much larger your legal department is if you factor that in. And so eventually we started on the journey of our third generation. And the third generation, one of the challenges there is really being able to start to take these reports out of business objects and making them more available to the users. So instead of it being controlled behind the curtain of the team and given to leadership, how do we start creating reports that we can schedule to be delivered to attorneys in their email boxes with spreadsheets? And of course, as we start giving more and more data out to more people, what we realize is data quality becomes the essential factor. We're no longer able to control and groom and serve to leadership. These things are going out automatically. People are accessing it from different directions. And so data quality continues to be one of our biggest challenges, but we tried to begin to solve that by centralizing data entry and beginning to insource building dashboards. So we moved from just using Business Objects SAP to using Microsoft Business Intelligence dashboards and having our internal team build those so we can start to make more data available to our users. Still very much though dependent on some outside resources because I mentioned our data quality was very bad. Even though we updated our guidelines to get outside counsel to start coding their time entry so it'd be more useful, believe it or not, they didn't actually start coding it better. So we would use outside services with an AI tool to groom that and be able to help us do more advanced kind of scorecards and analytics. And so ultimately what we're trying to get to in third generation is not just spend tracking or managing the work, but really how to analyze the performance. And so as we go forward and we start thinking about generation 4, data quality and how do we automate data intake so it's not going to have data entry errors is going to be key. And how do we continue to insource that ability for matter management and performance management? And the thing I'll kind of leave you with at the end of this journey, what is most important to you and where you're at, whether you're on generation 1, 2, 3, or 4. What I recognize is the most important thing is you have an engaged user. You heard Heidi talk about keeping the attorneys involved. If you don't have an engaged user, you can invent quantum physics and it's not going to be worth anything. So having somebody who really wants to work with you and use the data is important because they're the ones who know the context of it and they're the ones who are going to test to see if it's accurate and correct. And ultimately, if you're not giving out data and reports that's actually being useful, then the data and the reports don't matter. So whether you're at generation 1, 2, 3, or you're ready to start saying your ABCs, as long as you're actually doing something that's going to make a difference so somebody can use it, then your data reporting is successful. And when you go through enough generations, then you can join me in singing your do, re, mi's, and we can see what great heights we can all advance the industry to. So I just wanted to set up a little context of a data journey, and Heidi is going to be able to share us a little bit more detail about some specifics that go into her data journey and solutions that she was solving.
Greg had a question. When you look at this, and everybody's journey is a little bit different. From a time frame perspective, what did your generation 1 to generation 3 journey look like? And now in hindsight, do you think you would have taken a different path?
That's a great question, Danish. I think that I'm a big believer in the power of three, and it just so happens that each of these generations took about 3 years. So from 2014 to 2016, we were in that generation 1. We were able to use it to consolidate legal budgets and create more accountability around spend management. Generation 2 began with the new system install that kicked off in 2016, 17 and ended in 2019. And then generation 3, we're really just coming to the end of that. So I think so much of what we do is dependent on the teams of people we put together, the clients we're engaging with, and how you're actually getting to an end result. And usually that is kind of a 3-year journey, right? You're putting the team together to know what to do. You're engaging the client to get what they want. And then by year 3, you're actually starting to practice results and usefulness. And just as you get, it's kind of like, okay, now we're ready to go to the next one. So the 9 years has kind of encompassed those 3-year cycles of a generation. And that might seem a little bit long to some people, but it's better to make measured and reasonable pace than it is to expect things to happen in 9 months, and 9 years later, you're still at the starting point.
So basically you're saying your GC said you can take as much time as you want. I don't need this yesterday.
Well, there's always the expectation for wanting it now and yesterday, but then there's the reasonableness of getting something useful in a reasonable amount of time. And that's why I talked about having an engaged user. So that GC, hey, we were able to condense 30 days into 3 hours and start to give results, right? So along each of these steps of the journey, you make sure that you're creating some kind of bit of progress, right? You're not just taking 3 years to get to the end result. It's a journey of 1,000 steps. Begin with the first step. And when you're 300 steps in, you're a lot further along, even if you're not exactly at your aspired vision or destination.
That's wonderful. And I think that's a great setup to, Heidi and Alex, as we move towards you. And then we're going to come back and try to put this all into perspective. Heidi, you had a different sort of problem. You had a department that was not necessarily in even control of your spend. You were being told things. So your battle was a little bit different than even being asked for a report or something. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm going to take kind of building on Greg's and go into just a really specific use case. And this kind of ties back to one of the findings on the slides that Danish you began with, which was the extent that the respondents use data mining and analytics to predict matter or department budgets. So this use case is about department budgets. So this is based on my personal experience in-house, but something that I continue to see in our clients in terms of working within your company and with kind of your overall fiscal responsibility within and your annual budgeting processes with finance, as well as then even kind of your throughout the year, how you are updating or working with the business. In my example, we did charge back legal costs to the business, which is a big point of this use case. But how this began was when I got there, the kind of the annual legal budgets, from what I could tell, it was just kind of a roll of the dice, both for our cost center within legal, as well as I could not figure out how the line items for the business were being figured out. So it did seem like it really was just, it had been sort of historical spend and then plus or minus some percentage based on kind of overall companies' spending expectations, which to my mind, having been in the legal industry for a while at that point, I thought, how is that going to be accurate? And isn't there data or something that we could use rather than that data? The other thing too in this was the business was just, they were making their own decisions on that line item, again, to me, which didn't seem like they were the kind of informed user to know what the legal line item should be. And there wasn't any process where they conferred with us in legal. So none of this was really making sense to me. The other interesting piece was just that I would get our, monthly financial reports from finance, working with FP&A and with the controllers. And there would be random charges that would be hitting our legal cost center. And I realized after a while, anybody who thought something sounded like something legal, they would code it to legal. And it wasn't really ours. And so I would spend time tracking that down and trying to figure out whose cost it really was, because it didn't seem right that it was hitting our budget. So that's kind of the setup. And again, I do see this still at quite a few clients. And when I think about that finding, I think it was over 60% of the respondents to that survey either never use data to help with predicting their budgets or intend to do more. I think it was 60 or perhaps a little bit more. But so then going on to kind of the solution. So this was a combination of technology, of good data, and also winning hearts and minds of the lawyers, as well as the business, and also finance, of just kind of everybody working together to put a better, more defensible and truly kind of data-driven process in place to predict and to then agree upon those annual budgets. But a couple of policy things that we did too. Put in place a policy that only the legal department could retain or engage outside counsel. And I work with quite a few companies who do that, but we did take that then a step farther in working with finance. They were able to take I think we probably had SAP at the time, and make it so that nobody could actually hit the GL account for legal fees. So it kind of became, it was only used by legal, which really simplified things a lot. We also worked very closely with the business unit controllers to talk more about this process of how we could put a more accurate budget in place for them. Because as you can imagine, or as maybe those of you on the webinar here are experiencing, if a business or even with corporate finance put in an unrealistic budget for legal expenses, we all know what that looks like after you get, halfway through the year. You can begin the year with some favorability, and then they try to decrease your budget. They take it away. They don't understand how you can't straight line legal costs. And it ends up with everybody being frustrated or being upset with legal. So we got to a point where this process then, by using really good data, everybody understood the process, they understood the inputs, and we had realistic budgets. So how do we do that? We had clean data, and I can talk a bit more about that. But policy-wise, within the legal department, every matter that utilized outside counsel, it was just required to have a budget. And I've heard objections to that in the past of, I don't know what it's going to be, or it's going to change a lot, or the dollar value is too low. Those are all objections that you can overcome. We had thresholds, for example, and even like drop downs where if it was under a $5,000 budget, etc. There were things like that you could do to simplify it. We also did allow for budgets to be changed, the matter budgets, and these were done for current year and next year were the two data points that we tracked, because those two then enabled us to do this budgeting and forecasting. So every matter required those. The lawyers or paralegals could change those budgets. It was all tracked, so I could see how that changed. And with that good data and agreement from the lawyers that this was accurate, we got to a point then when it became August and September, and we were beginning the annual budgeting process, both for our corporate legal cost center, as well as then for the legal budget that the businesses would receive from us. That was all based on real data. So it was based on the open matters and what was still out there for the budgets, as well as the next year budget. And then, of course, everybody's going to say, well, what about the work we don't know about yet? Of course, we all know that happens too. You don't have all of your legal costs aren't known in September for the next year. But I was able to do a look back at the data. The data was pretty clean at that point. And I was able to do a look back of kind of running data from that time period and then looking at what actually happened. And with enough data, I was able to get an average that by September, there was still approximately 30 to 35%, which kind of makes sense, right, of the unknown. So we would take what was out there in terms of the actual numbers in the tool that we used and agreed with the lawyers. We talked about any sort of outliers that were coming. For example, if we had a shareholder litigation or something that truly was an outlier, but we would add in then that percentage that, again, through data proved that historically it was pretty accurate. And we were able then to get to that budget for the next year. The businesses then more or less sort of had to accept the budget that we gave them, but because it was defensible, we could show them the process that we went through to get it. Pretty hard to refute. Our job then in legal and as the lawyers was just to manage that work as responsibly as possible, and to then throughout the year provide, in our situation, in that case, we provided quarterly updates with the head of the business and with the controller for those businesses, and showing exactly where we were relative to those forecasts and whether or not anything had changed, and had changed our assumptions to the positive or the negative. Overall, and ended up being a pretty smooth process. I think the lawyers ended up liking it a lot after a little bit of convincing, because I think at first there was quite a bit of resistance to every matter having a budget, for example, but it got to be pretty straightforward. I think after they realized it was okay to make changes and they didn't have to know everything perfectly, it became just part of our routine. We did have our initial data in the system, and this goes back a while, but this was with eCounsel at the time. We brought in data from what had been a homegrown system, and we cleaned that data. I mean, we made sure that was good data. We made sure then that everybody was utilizing the system in the same way. And of course, we had the new budgeting fields for current year, next year, and we reported throughout the year with the department. The change management point there, again, I think with any system and with any kind of a process like this, where you want to have good data that you can use for predicting and for really solid decision making, you really have to have, to Greg's point, you really have to have engaged users and stakeholders. And in this example, this use case is the lawyers, and it was also finance, and then the business controllers. Also too, over time, we just had sufficient data. You know, if you end up, in my experience, if you have a minimum of 18 months of clean data, it can be pretty predictive. In my experience, my 10 years in-house, it was really my 18 months that was most predictive of the next 12 months. If I went back 3 years, while that sounds better, it actually, in my experience at that time, it was not. I ran both calculations, and it was more accurate to have used the prior 18 months. But that's my very specific case study and use case of a really deep dive into how to use the data to help with an expected and reasonable corporate process in the annual budgeting. So with that, back to Danish.
Well, it's a great example, Heidi. I mean, you were very specific in explaining it. Let me ask you a question. So what did that do for your legal operations team, or even your legal department as a general? Was this activity more of seen like a land grab for getting back the finances and people in the business didn't like it? Or did it really elevate your position in the organization that legal knows what they're doing?
Great question. It was really more legal knows what they're doing. We worked, so at first, finance really did not like working with legal, because the prior process had been, the poor guy in finance had to go to individual lawyers to gather information, and he did not like that process. So we centralized it, right, in legal operations. And then with the business, we were very proactive. So they liked that we were coming to them with what, and again, it was defensible, right? We had the data to show it, and they really liked it, because they didn't like the prior version, which too many surprises, right? Where they had a budget that was based on, nothing, based on fiction, but they had a budget that they would end up not meeting or being mad at legal because by, July we had blown the budget because there was something that they hadn't factored in. So it became very much legal from a fiscal responsibility, fiscal stewardship became viewed very positively.
Wonderful. So I'm sure folks in the chat and the attendees have a lot of questions. So I think right now would be the time to start typing in some questions. As we sort of hand over the mic to Alex, you've heard from Greg sort of his overall journey and how, they kind of look at different generations of improvement. We've heard from Heidi how she was able to take sort of from ground zero a journey towards more fiscal management. And I would love to hear from Alex how we can look at a framework that gets us there. I mean, all of us know about billing systems, technology systems, ELM, and a lot of either technologies are thrown there or financial models are thrown there. But Alex, in your opinion, you've been both on the law firm side, you've been in-house, you've been speaking a lot about this. Can you give us some sort of framework and guidelines that, as folks are either doing this or starting to think about this, what do they need to have in mind to make this successful?
Thank you, Danish. So one of the things that we are looking at, and something I'm looking at now in my new role, is I say we're data challenged. And that when I say that, I mean, we have a lot of data in a lot of places. You don't know what's outdated, what's good, what's not. And unfortunately, not all data points are helpful. I mean, there's a lot of data out there that do not tell any kind of story, but we're supposed to come up with some magical analysis of a story and help people make some decisions. And that's not always the case. So everyone always says, and it's a very, very well-known cliche, data doesn't lie. The data doesn't lie, but the stories that happen around the data certainly do, because sometimes we get incomplete data and that can tell one story. And then there's the data that's that's appended by when we don't know the duration or how old it is, like Katie talked about. When it's 18 months versus 3 years, and now you think you're only looking at the last 12 months, the data could certainly tell an unrealistic story. So where do you start? And looking at this, it's a little overwhelming, right? When you come in and there's nothing there, and you're trying to figure out what's important. You really have to hone in on what are the problems that you're trying to answer and what are the questions you're trying to address. But at the end of the day, not all questions, and not all data will point you to an actionable result. And that is one of those things that, in order to get to an actionable result, is making sure that the data that you're capturing really is going to be measured in a specific way. And with that, I'll talk a little bit about what is a good KPI. And we've heard this when you're talking about goals. This has been said many, many times that goals should be SMART. And, there's all this information out there. Why? Because if it's not measurable, it's not helpful. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't achieve a goal if you don't know what is your actual goal. The same thing with KPIs, key performance indicators. In my previous role, we had lots of them. And unfortunately, when you set up a bunch of them, you think, well, all of these are going to help the leadership make better decisions because I have 20 KPIs and all these firms are being measured against a lot of KPIs. In reality, a lot of the KPIs were not updatable. We couldn't really, there was a lot of subjectivity happening. There was a lot of, interpretation around it. So in order to set up a good KPI, we have to do a few things. We have to identify KPIs. So we really want to talk about, we need to set some relevant KPIs that go against your performance or the questions you're trying to answer. You want to also create some kind of tool, dashboard, pivot table, something that flushes out the data that shows you the performance of those KPIs. If you cannot see what's happening on a regular basis and you cannot keep them, if you cannot measure these on a continuous basis, how do you know what's performing and what's not? How do you know if you're moving in the right direction? Then you have to evaluate them. How are you going to be able to achieve your business goals off these KPIs? Are they going to be helping leadership make decisions? And sometimes when we evaluate them, we decide to change them and say, you know what, maybe we started off with 20, but we really only need to focus in on 5. These 5 really make a difference in how we behave. And that's where you go into the assessment, right? Do they still align with the goals of the business, the goals of your corporation, the goals of your law department? Because a lot of the times our KPIs, started off with good intentions, but they really didn't do much for our actions that happen later. In a practical sense, and when we're thinking about data-driven decisions in practice, sometimes we focus on one thing too much, right? So looking at, working in any legal department, whether you're on the corporate side or the law firm side, spend is a big, big KPI. That is the most important. That's the one everyone's looking at. That is the number everyone's talking about. How much money do you spend? How big is your budget? How much are corporate clients paying us for this work? That spend number becomes that finish line. And sometimes that's the one KPI everyone focuses on, when in reality, sometimes that does not change behavior. Knowing the number you spend does not ultimately change behavior. So focusing in on just the finish line, we're missing the milestones in between, right? The little stops along the way where you stop and get some water, because you need those in order to keep going. So looking at the same KPI and not changing it, not assessing it, not reevaluating it, and then expecting behavior to change over time, is not going to happen. One of the things that we have to do is take a step back and say, what else can we look at? And one of the examples I have is, we were looking at diversity spend of our suppliers. How much of the spend was actually going to suppliers on a quarterly basis. It started off quarterly basis just on spend. And every quarter we were showing the number, and the percentage was staying the same quarter over quarter. We went to monthly. And, so then the second time you show the number, your month, the same month. So then now we took a step back and said, well, let's look at the actions that are happening at the beginning. How many times are diverse suppliers being invited to submit bids on tenders or RFPs? And the percentage was exactly the same as the outcome of the percentage of spend, which then you start to, to say, well, if they're not even being invited, how are we going to increase spend overall? And that change actually started to move the needle, because people started thinking about it on something that they could make a difference in, an action now that the lawyers could take. And if the lawyers can take that action, then there's going to be a change in behavior, and there's going to be a change in the output. And again, what is the problem we're trying to solve? We always go back to that when I'm looking at all this data, and the data is being put in front of our lawyers. Instead of giving them homework, I'm trying to give them options with the data and say, if you go through door A, this is the possibility. If you go through door B, this is the other possibility. So when they make their ultimate decision, they know that, there could be a dud behind door B. And then how does change happen? One of the most important things about change is really thinking about it in a holistic way, right? Sometimes when things aren't going well, we are quick to assume that people do not know what they are doing and they're not following the procedures. But sometimes there's pieces missing of that puzzle. And in our path, we are missing, if the process is not clearly defined or outlined, where we know that we need to take steps forwards, or sometimes even take a step back because it's clear which steps are required throughout our process, people will fail. Any technology can do many things. And as we're talking about all this new technology that's out there, especially with the very hot topic of AI and, using a lot of these great platforms that are out there, they can do many great things. But if they're not incorporated into the process of everyday working, and people do not know how to use them, and the training is not there, the technology will also fail. So these three things are extremely important for us to incorporate change into any of our departments, whether we're on the corporate or the law firm side.
That's such a wonderful example. As you were saying that, telling that story, it just reminded me, a few years ago, I was working at an insurance law department. And for folks who are not familiar with the insurance typically has three different legal teams: a corporate legal teams that works on the day-to-day legal corporate litigation matters, a staff counsel, which is sort of an in-house captive law firm, and a retained counsel team, which just sends out matters that they can't adjudicate internally. The internal teams they have to send out. And we're preparing for these preferred provider annual reviews, the dreaded sort of get all the data in, get all the conversations set up and preparing. And the head of legal ops had to go do those, and this one we were dreading because we had promised this firm, everybody liked this firm, but we hadn't been able to move so much work to them. And our deal was that we'll maybe have to soft pedal here, make them feel loved so they continue to work with us and give all the benefits that we were getting from them. And the head of legal ops comes back in 45 minutes. And in my mind, I was like, either this is a very great conversation or this is a very bad conversation. That's a very short meeting. But it was interesting. I mean, the head of legal ops was like, hey, I went in there for first 10 minutes. I was just confused. The couple of partners had come in from the law firm and they were so excited. They were thanking us so much. And they said, we'd love to work more. At some point, it's like, time out. I mean, we got to talk about, I am totally lost. And what ended up happening was that even though the legal department and the team that had put the panel firms together hadn't given them enough work, they apparently were getting 3 times the work from the retained counsel team. So, apparently the law firm thought that they were, all one team was working, but internally those 2 teams had no clue that that was happening. And so it's interesting that that whole data gap or the data story can only tell you as long as you're looking into it in the right direction.
Correct.
So we have a question here. I think we can go around the room, kind of talk about what critical data points did you discover in your journeys that may have not been obvious at the outset, or maybe just overlooked? I guess, what are the learnings as you go along, some nuggets of wisdom that we can sort of be aware of? Greg, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, I'll just kind of say quickly, it's about the timing of spend data. So kind of building on what Heidi talked about in managing the budget and what Alex talked about in recognizing what's the right kind of KPI. I talked about how when we condensed 30 days to 3 hours and we said, okay, $5 million in March. Well, that wasn't really $5 million of spend in March. That was $5 million of received invoices in March, 3 million of which was from work that was done in December. So one of the most critical things was moving to accrual-based accounting and starting it at an annual basis and then at a quarterly basis. And now we're still troubled with the fact that invoices come in 30 days after the end of the month. So that's 60 days after the work is done. So being able to use invoice time entry data from outside counsel as a form of project management is incredibly challenging because you can't take action on something that's 30 days late. But at least by moving to the accrual, we began to gain competency with finance because finance has been doing accrual since 1970, right? And so now you could begin to say, well, if we're forcing accruals at the end of June, we at least really know what we've spent in the first 6 months of the year, and we can gate that so we're not getting surprise invoices in September. So for us, it was really the timing of data between when it's received versus when the work is done versus when are you able to see it and actually take action on it, whether at a leadership level or a management level.
I think Cindy has a great point in the chat as well, that I think just that focus on process and improving the process can make a lot of difference as well. As she's mentioned, there were some emails involved and, and if you can improve that, that alone can also improve your cycle of data, like Greg, you're telling about timing and so on. Alex, from your standpoint, anything that you think of that, just that was a great learning or aha moment for you?
There was a lot of assumptions that are made when the data is not always there. For us, on the client side, looking at, we had many firms saying, we're not getting invited to enough work. We're not getting enough spend from you. And then really being able to flesh that out and show them in a very concise way and saying you were actually invited to this many RFPs in the last month, and in the short timing in the last month, you declined 2 due to conflicts, you declined 2 due to capabilities. So so when you start to break it down in that way, it's not that they weren't invited, but the ones that they actually responded to, they would actually have a higher percentage than they were assuming they did. And sometimes those data points start to show up. And I think there was that question around critical data points are based on the questions that keep coming up over and over again. You want to address those. You want to, you want people to trust in what you're saying. And sometimes the only way to do that is by highlighting the activity. And you can only know that as you're going through your processes as to what is going to become more critical or more something that's more pressure at that time, more important or significant in that time period.
Hadi, I'll take some comments from you, and then we're going to close up with some parting thoughts.
I'm just going to build a little bit on Greg's point too about accruals, and just my experience too was that what finance reported and what we reported in our tool were different. So that was then tricky for my GC, right? Because he didn't have the right number, or it seemed like somebody was wrong. So this is where the whole thing with accruals and really making sure that process works well, that was kind of a surprise to me. In fact, when I went to Sara Lee, Sears had been cash-based, which is pretty unusual. So when I moved to accrual, I didn't understand this, but I felt then it was my job to figure it out and to make sure that my GC had the right numbers at the big level, right? And that's something I still believe really strongly in. The GCs don't need all the details that we might need. That's, I think, our job is to understand all the data, but the GCs need to know the big numbers, and they need to know the numbers that align with finance. And if there's a reason that it's different, or there's like a settlement that gets included somewhere, it's important that he or she knows that. So I guess that was kind of to answer the question that was in the chat. Like, that was something that it surprised me that there was that difference. And I wanted to work really hard to make sure that we were aligned going forward. And again, that the GC felt comfortable and credible with the numbers.
Heidi, cool. As you hit on that topic, I've kind of informally said that data is multidimensional. So when you're just taking a snapshot of data, like in a spend tracking, that's one dimension. When you want to start to compare that with some other attributes of categories or context, that's two dimensions. When you get to the third dimension, that's timing. And so often, like you highlighted, the timing of finance is different than the timing of ops, is different than the timing of the outside counsel. And now everybody's looking at the same diamond, but some are looking at the top and it looks like a circle, and some are looking at the side, it looks like a triangle, and some are looking at the bottom and it looks like a dot. They're all looking at the same thing, but it's that different dimensional perspective, and realizing that you can get really twisted up and confused if you rush forward into those dimensions is part of the reason why it is kind of important to really peel it back systematically, like Alex highlighted, and really understand the process, the platform, and the different people that are involved in it.
Cool. Well, I think that's really helpful. I know we're not going to get to all the questions, but we'll try to probably answer offline if any questions are left. But just kind of going through, like, summarizing what we've learned. I mean, we talked about data being a real differentiator. Data can really elevate your law department and your legal operations function, not only within the legal function itself, but also within the company. You can really go toe-to-toe with other value creation functions in your organizations. Just as we leave, I mean, I think you've heard sort of from a journey perspective what your expectations should be. It's not sort of a one-time deal. If you treat it as more of a generational journey, it will help. You've learned from Heidi of what specific tasks you can take to get control of your data and positioning in the organization. Alex kind of laid out that people process mechanism, that let's not look at it as just looking at the numbers or putting a billing technology, and let's take all of it together and kind of measure it along as we go. And if needs change, then adapt as well. So, I mean, this is, again, some metrics. I mean, you see that how much everybody focuses on outside counsel spend, but like Alex said, noting down how many RFPs a law firm was invited to, or noting down their DE&I performance, as you put together your KPIs, you really need to think of it as a holistic program. And to bring it all together, I think if you look at when we're really talking about spend or enterprise legal management, you do need to have some baseline data or systems, whether it's an Excel sheet or whether it's truly a system that helps you operationally, an e-billing system where you can gather this information, outside counsel guidelines, system, process, bills, build in some reports that can let you figure out what data you're capturing. And then you can sort of continue to climb up that strategic decision-making process, right? We can create some dashboards that focus on specific KPIs. We heard about AI-supported bill review. There's a lot of tools out there that can help you as you're reviewing the bill there and then, help you figure out how to better review those bills. Day to day, we're all busy. I mean, not all of us have time to look at the bill in detail or call the law firm up and figure it out. So there are services out there that can sit on top of your AI and e-billing systems where specialized bill reviewers can review your bills, talk to your law firms. I think Greg talked about some external help, making sure your relationships are not affected, making sure you're not just kind of reviewing the bill for the sake of it. And then there are other sort of levers you can use as building a preferred panel program. Another one that that I see not everybody's very familiar with are market.
Looks like we might have just lost Danish there, but Alex and Heidi maybe giving some parting thoughts. I would just like to put an advocation in for diversity. We really have found at Kaiser that diversity is a place for innovation. It can be protected and incubated. And what started off as helping to move our diverse timekeepers, we were having 50% of our work done by females already. But when we got it coded properly, we found out the majority of work they were doing was administrative, and the males were doing the more mission critical kind of work. So when we got it coded properly, we were able to get that work balanced better. And before you know it, aren't we doing legal project management work? So just like to say, think about how diversity and using data with diversity can help drive new innovation. Maybe Alex and Heidi, some parting thoughts.
I would totally agree with that. I think we have to keep pushing on that front, and we can't let up just because we've been talking about it for a while, but it needs to be a collaborative and united effort from both sides of from everyone involved.
Great. And Danish, we were just filling in with some parting thoughts, maybe Heidi.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're at time, so I would like to say thank you to everyone. Really appreciate the recording is available. We can send it out to you, or you can request Colin and team to send it out. You've been really a great audience, great participation. Hopefully this was helpful. Thank you very much.
You're a great panel crew. Keep the data analytics music rolling.
There you go.
Bye-bye.